In the interest of time, we must continue. We are in the middle of the break, but hopefully we are going to attract attention if we start the discussion, and I already see people coming. It's a great pleasure that we have this important topic during the European Data Summit. And it's great that you have found time to be with us and express your thoughts on the relevance of open data to fight the pandemic. I'm going to support Marie, but I don't think that she will need my support, and I'm really looking forward to your discussion. Please,
yeah,
Marie.
Thank you, Pencho. So today we have a panel that is only with panelists via video. So let's hope the connection will stay that way and we have a great discussion. I'd like to welcome you to our panel session 5 today on open government data and in fighting COVID-19. Today with us we have Lucia from the OECD, analyst on digital government and open data. I read your blog posts on fighting COVID with open government data, so I'm very interested in hearing your opinion about it, as well as hearing from you on the call by the OECD on for evidence on the release and use of open government data. So welcome. We have P.Maassen with us from the Open Government Partnership. I think, Paul, you have a long experience in seeing different countries working with initiatives on open government, and maybe you can give us an insight on how open government initiatives have maybe even changed during the pandemic. Welcome to you as well. We have R.Samson with us from the ODI today. She worked in politics, so maybe you can even give us an insight from inside politics on the other side, how it is to release open data, what the discussions are. Welcome to you as well, and I'm looking forward to your insights today. And last but not least, we have A.Calderon from the International Open Data Charter. I mean, you have a very international background, so maybe you can join us and give some insights on sharing data across countries, how civil societies are working with open data. Yeah, welcome to you all. I'm looking forward to the discussion. And maybe first we can start with some statements from you to set the ground and see how open government data can help fight COVID in these times. Maybe Lucia, would you like to start?
Hi, do you hear me well?
Yes.
Great. Thank you very much for having me. Before I talk about our call for evidence, I'll give you a bit of background of why we started it. So since we increasingly witness the strategic role that data can play, it is important for governments to create conditions for improving the quality of public services, increasing the effectiveness of public spending, and also strengthening trust from citizens. So this is why the OECD and the NYU GovLab have launched an open call for evidence on the release and use of open government data, OGD, in response to COVID-19 outbreak. And from the evidence, my team and I were able to draw insights, paying attention to the different activities and outputs, the needs addressed, the potential users, the type of analysis, and also stage of crisis management that they fit into. Sort of, for example, pandemic response or recovery, etc. So here are some figures and observations. First of all, we observed that data repositories and dashboards were perhaps not so surprisingly the most produced outputs. And then we also noticed that 75% of initiatives are linked to public health, 19% to economics needs, which are only based on data that we collected at a relatively early stage. Then also we've seen that 75% of initiatives aimed at building situational awareness, while only 10% aimed at predicting or measuring impacts. Then the majority of initiatives are targeting civil societies and general public as potential users, while only several targeted business. Then we have also about 83% of our initiatives that were focusing on immediate crisis response, whereas only 13 were covering recovery stage. So to wrap up, I'll actually share some of the main insights that we have drawn based on the observations from the call. First of all, the release of open government data during the COVID-19 pandemic has hugely facilitated public communications. It has helped on the delivery of evidence-based policy responses, the scrutiny of government interventions, and the development of innovation, as well as innovative scientific solutions. So most open data initiatives have focused on creating awareness and communicate about the status of the pandemic. And also within governments, open data efforts are concentrated within health ministries. There's no evident involvement of more specific open data bodies in the development of these initiatives. It could be helpful to focus on providing meaningful understanding and interpretation to the data, and at the same time fulfill the public role of keeping the public informed about government's health, economic and social actions. We've also observed that there is a need to reshape the role of central bodies responsible for OGD. The role of OGD leading bodies can support and advise authorities in making data relevant to users, and also make sure that there are quality data to enable impactful reuse. And then last but not least, observation is that published data are not always fit for multiple purposes. So we've observed that although a large quantity of data are made available through repositories and government portals, there is actually little evidence of new services or innovations created through the reuse of that data. And throughout exchanges with delegates, we've noticed that it is not only about availability of data, but it's also about availability of meaningful data. So the pandemic demonstrated that data was not necessarily being fit for purpose. Its usage and expectation have not always been clear to users and developers. So for this purpose, governments can advance in identifying relevant data sets or strengthening data inventories like through data audits as part of broader data governance for crisis management activities. So this could facilitate speed up identification, access to and sharing of critical data, including OGD. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. Maybe we can go more into depth later on having central bodies for open government data and how governments cope with that in different structures around the world. Paul, do you want to comment on that, how open government initiatives have changed during the pandemic? And as Lucia said, the communication improved and how civil servants, civil society work together in improving and fighting the pandemic.
Yeah, thanks. Let me take a bit of a step back and sort of a little bit of history of where we started at the beginning of the pandemic with open data and open government, and then see how the pandemic influenced that or not. The ambition of OGP, right, is very simple. It's about making government more open and transparent, deliver better for citizens in a way. And the governments that we work with, whether they're local or national, we ask them to do three things, right? We ask them to have a dialogue with government and civil society, a permanent dialogue, develop commitments of how they want to make government more open, and lock that down into your action plans. And then we assess them on the quality both of that cooperation between government and civil society, as well as the ambition and delivery of the action plan. And I'll come to why this is relevant, because that pre-trajectory, in a way, helps fight a pandemic when the need is high. So in our early years, a lot of countries made commitments around open data, but they were very often about opening up as much data as possible, not necessarily opening up high quality data, not necessarily opening up data in standardized form, or the most important data sets, let alone that there was a discussion about how that data would be used and by whom, or being invested in the uptake of data, which again is something you will see back in the pandemic. The understanding in the early years was it is about transparency and more is better. And I think the open government movement, as well as the open data movement the last decade, has very much evolved from a place of this is about opening up information and data to a place of this is about opening up the right data and allowing researchers, citizens, civil society, and others to use the data for creating a better government. So what we've seen over the years is that governments are opening up more targeted data on procurement, for example, on budget allocation, but also on the quality of health and education, areas that can make a real difference. We see our members follow better the standards of organizations like ANYA's to make sure that if they release data, they do it in a certain way. And we see a trend also towards more actionable data, so data you can actually use directly. Now, this is important because it's one of the most popular topics in the open government domain. Out of the about 4,000 commitments that were made over the last decade in OGP, 20% or so has an open data component to it. So it's a very popular topic for governments that want to do open government. And the commitments they make are the same level of ambition, so they're not more ambitious than commitments on regular procurement or extractives or whatever topic you take, but they are better in delivery. So open data commitments in the Open Government Partnership are more often delivered than other commitments. What a state of emergency does to a government and to a country is something we very clearly see. Government at a moment like that is not acting as they would normally do, right? Everything is in an emergency mode. And what you see is that several of the normal practices and safeguards that normally are in place, a practice, for example, to release contracts, suddenly gets sidetracked, oversight gets sidetracked. Watchdog officials their role gets diminished because there is a pandemic and we have to respond. So let's forget about some of these safeguards and rights for a moment. So when we measured infringements of our members during the pandemic on the fundamental rights, there's a couple of things we saw. For example, if you take access to information as the broader umbrella that open data is part of, we've seen across our members examples of extension of time limits to respond to access to information requests, for example, in Moldova, Romania, or even suspension of time limits in France and Spain. We've seen Bosnia and Montenegro, Romania, Serbia, all imposing limitations on media and restricting free speech, with the idea of limiting disinformation, which is a laudable cause, but in the wrong hands and exercised for too long a time period, it becomes problematic. A positive thing about Europe, one positive example about Europe is sex disaggregated data. That is relatively problematic around the pandemic if we look across our members, but Europe is actually doing quite well there compared to the rest of the world. For example, in Slovakia, the health ministry provides the epidemiological research reports very transparently in a gold standard open license so that the community can read them, absorb them, and respond to them. In France, a website was launched by the biggest network of hospitals to very quickly sort of say, okay, this is where the shortages are. This is the type of stuff we need. Something that before was quite problematic. There was earlier in the week conference, a GovTech conference, and the German Minister of Health was speaking. He was saying something similar. He said for a long, long time, from a political level, they had wanted transparency on the number of ICU beds available. It was always problematic and difficult. But now the pandemic allowed for something to happen that before was problematic. So it's not all negative in that sense. Sometimes a pandemic like this accelerates reforms that were not there before. Two more examples, and then I'll come to a close. Examples of where existing OGP structures helped, and the fact that there is a permanent dialogue helped quickly respond to what the pandemic needed. For example, when in the Netherlands they were trying to reduce the access to information response rates, response time, the fact that there was a dialogue between the watchdogs and the government around open government meant that the conversation around access to information and the importance of keeping it going during the pandemic could happen very quickly. Something similar happened in Latvia, where the emergency procurement contracts were not published automatically, whereas Latvia has a good track record in publishing their procurement contracts. But the fact that the dialogue was there and the trust was there between the actors meant that very quickly Latvia organized a workaround, and those contracts were published as well. In Ukraine, which is one of the leading countries where it comes to transparent procurement and tendering, there it actually worked the other way around. Because their system of openness around tenders and procurement was so good, there was not even a second or a glitch between the same transparency and openness around COVID emergency contract. So my conclusion of it is that the pandemic creates a whole bunch of stress moments and crises at the same time, right? It's a health crisis, it's an economic crisis, on top of the crisis of democracy we already had before to an extent, and inequality. But in a pandemic, when everything has to be faster and better in a way, where there was an existing infrastructure around open data, where there were existing relationship between the different actors, where there was trust also, things could happen quickly. If you have to start thinking and running with open data and the role of open data in a pandemic, at the moment the pandemic hits you, you're too late. So in general, open government approaches or open data approaches, in my view, are not that different in times of crisis. I mean, if you know what you have to do to be open and transparent and inclusive and responsive in normal times, it's not that different in times of the pandemic. But because it's faster, because of the risk of squeezing the rights and of corruption and of making mistakes, it helps if there is an existing infrastructure. And that's important because if in that crunch moment of a pandemic you get it wrong, then you further erode the trust of citizens in institutions, which was already so much under stress before the pandemic. I'll stop there.
Yeah, thank you, Paul, so much. Really interesting that you mentioned the Ministry of Health in Germany. Maybe we can also discuss later the case of Germany and how crisis response and publishing more open data or less open data was here. Renate, maybe you can comment on the other crisis mode Paul talked about. Do you see from the ODI perspective how the publication of open data changed within the governments and in politics? Is it discussed more openly? Is there, does it lead to more open data? Can we say so?
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Hello? Okay, great. I'm sorry, I really can't answer that question. That's not really the work that we've been doing at the ODI over the course of this pandemic. So would it be possible for me to just give a bit of a very brief overview of what we've been doing at the ODI?
Of course, yeah.
Brilliant. So at the start of the pandemic, we realized that we had an opportunity, because we have a reasonably wide network, to be able to ask people who might not be traditional people who would be working in open data spaces to say, we've got data that we think might be helpful to address the pandemic and the emergency situation, but we don't know how to make it open. Can you help? So we can help you make things open. So that's what we did. We put a call out through some funding that we got from Illuminate to say to people, have you got data and do you want to know how to make it open? And because open data, as we all know, when published, made accessible, can help much better, quicker decision making. So we had a stream of people get in touch with us, and one of our immediate examples that we worked with was one of the symptom tracking applications that started up basically by a group of guys around their digital kitchen table, if you wish, who realized that they had some skills to put an app together that could monitor people's symptoms if they so chose to, but didn't need to breach people's privacy and could just be done on a wide geographic area, so the start of a postal code area, for example. So they were full of beans and enthusiasm, and the app that they built and designed and got live really quickly found itself on the desk of a number of large US academic organizations who were keen to make the most of this data. So they came to us and said, we want to get it out there as quickly and as messily, if you wish, as we can. Can you teach us how to do open data fast? Kind of the opposite of what Paul's been saying. We actually went back to sort of basics of, this is what you need to do. You need to get it out there quickly. You need to describe it really well, and you need to publish it with an open license. So we were being very sort of grassrootsy and hands-on with people, with small organizations, with larger organizations, saying this is the importance of open data. We all want to be able to make some great, fast decisions about information that's out there. This is how to ensure that it's published and shared more widely, and that access is available more widely. So that was one of our initial processes and success stories. From that, we've been trying to establish if there needs to be standards in the symptom tracking app environment, which clearly is the case, because as the whole point of describe it well is often one of the sticking blocks to this, to making data accessible. It might be out there, but it might have a different name. And these are all problems that we're all very familiar with, but they still remain problems. And that can often be confusing and frustrating to people who aren't familiar in this environment. So that was one of the things we've done. We've also written and distributed and championed and spoken about at a wide range of events our guides on how to do open data. We're convening public and private sector because whilst there is a desire to get together, to chat, to share, to create access, to listen to other people's needs, often we're finding that people are still speaking on a very high level. They're not identifying a specific question, a specific problem that they want to be able to communicate and work together on. So there's still a lot of trying to get people to say, this is our problem. We've got this data, but we need this, and this. How can we work together? How can we collaborate to create access? Even if the data is not necessarily going to be open data, but how do we know it's out there and how can we access it? So this remains an ongoing problem. And whilst I think that there's been some great work in this area, I would imagine that lots of people on this panel and across this conference could probably say there's still a lot of frustration out there. And that's not just about individual people's data, but it is also business data and government data. There's still a lot of thinking of data as a block, as a thing that can't be separated into different parts, but separating it into different parts and identifying specific questions and specific problems might help us move a little bit quicker. We've also been doing an awful lot of research and about mobility data and identifying where mobility data could be used and collaborated on better. And basically, we're just trying, as ever, to spread the word that open is great, access is really important too, and that we shouldn't be afraid or nervous if we don't really understand how to do it, because there are ways of doing it quick and easily, and anything is a good starting point.
Yeah, thank you so much. Really interesting that you said we need to be even quicker than before the pandemic, and how that is working out. Maybe we can touch upon that later. Anja, when the data is open and available, how do we share data even across countries, organizations, public bodies, to make the most of the data we have?
Yeah, thank you for the question, and thanks firstly for the invitation. It's great to be here, though it feels a bit strange that I can't see you all, but lovely to be here nonetheless.
I see you all.
As mentioned,
It's the second summit of Anja, and it's really sad that she couldn't join us this time. But
okay. Maybe next time.
Yes, I hope to be there in person next time. So as mentioned, I head a global organization called the OpenData Charter, which is a collaboration of over 100 governments and expert organizations working to open up data to address targeted policy challenges. And we believe this can only be achieved by governing data inclusively and accountably. And as I think it has become increasingly clear in several discussions we've been having throughout the day today, COVID-19 has exposed fault lines in our information ecosystems. And this pandemic, what I think has been quite interesting, has really brought concerns, brought together concerns from both transparency advocates and privacy champions closely together that we've had in the past, and it's brought them to the fore. So we have seen how access to quality and timely data has been instrumental in helping model and flatten the curve, as well as informing both individual and collective decision-making around the world. How important it is for the public to know and trust that information. For example, what information is underpinning how governments are making decisions, what are the safeguards and limitations around that data, and at the same time, there are legitimate concerns that have been raised about how this data is used, how it is both safeguarded and made open, both now and in the future. So one of the biggest concerns that we are seeing in how data is currently being shared to fight the pandemic, both in the EU and around the world, is that it's so clear now that we were not adequately prepared with the infrastructure or the kinds of institutions that we need to support responsible, fast flows of data and trustworthy data use. So I will focus on three preliminary findings from a review that we have been conducting in over 20 countries from around the world that are publishing COVID-related data, as well as a series of open COVID data community consultations that we're hosting together with our network of government adopters, as well as in partnership with the OECD and other organizations. We're looking at high-value data types, as well as practical actions needed towards supporting what we're calling open data governance pathways. So the first one has to do with the impact of a lack of consistency on how we quantify, report, and interpret the actual scope of the pandemic. And as has been mentioned already, there is no global common standard for how we should treat data about pandemics. This has led to very different approaches, both within and across countries, about what they decide to track and then what they decide to make public. And the types of data where we're seeing most disparities or gaps have to do with demographic data about people, how they are affected, as well as the capacity that we have to respond. This can be seen, for example, in considerable differences between how gender, age, or age brackets are reported in the cases where data is available. There's also very little data being made available related to the health sector capacity, though it's great to hear also some good examples Paul has already mentioned. And then while some countries are paying special attention to understanding the vulnerabilities of certain minority and marginalized groups, such as tracking ethnicity, underlying health conditions, and migration status, there's little consistency or adequate safeguards in how this is being done. And this is going to be crucial if we want to put the hardest hit communities at the center of COVID-19 response. But it can only be done while protecting against things like surveillance or profiling of different demographic groups. So to foster the international joined up action that we're going to need to meet this global challenge, we still have a long way to go for data to be comparable across jurisdiction. The second finding has to do with how transparency and accountability have been so crucial for the public to trust decisions. There's been a really strong demand for tracking how funds are mobilized, and this goes as far as understanding that there's an equitable distribution to guarantee that resources are reaching those that need it most. And interestingly, this type of data has been one that, although in some cases we've seen open data or access to information have been halted or delayed, there has been consistent publishing of procurement data, though yet with some signals about corruption or irregularities happening in the space. And it's, I guess, no surprise because the health sector is one that is most prone to corruption, even in times when there is no emergency. And then to close, something that has come up time and again in our recent discussions is that governments and data stewards must be able to adapt and adjust. Our data systems need to be more dynamic and responsive to move with the times. And this has been largely covered in previous panels, but this means new types of data institutions, context-specific data governance models are urgently needed. And as importantly, that means investing in building the skills to train people with clear roles and responsibilities, such as what has been mentioned as data intermediaries or trustees, that we believe are essential for upholding fundamental principles of openness, while at the same time safeguarding against risks behind these institutions.
Yeah, thank you so much.
I think I'll leave it at that. Thanks.
Thank you so much for all your statements. I would like to open the discussion more on having central bodies. Lucia, you started with saying it's better to have central bodies, public sector bodies opening their data, maybe instead of having different regional data, different standards, different ways in publishing the data. Could you elaborate more on why it's better to have a central approach rather than a decentralized approach? Is that what you were wanting to say?
Yes, this is correct. So based on the call that we had, we've also drew some recommendations based on the trends and insights. We have clarified a couple of opportunities, and we think that government should strengthen, for example, public sector data governance as the foundation for effective and consistent management, sharing, and open up and use of government data that brings public value. So, which leads to considering as well data governance bodies being centralized, and so establishing emergently government data bodies being responsible for coordinating and promoting necessary cross-government and multi-level government data sharing and release during the crisis, so that it's a bit more standardized and also sharing the same information. Because this is what we've seen, for example, the example of Chile. We've seen that Chile has released some health data, and it has been used by two ministries at the same time, which creates also confusions to the citizens. Therefore, we highly recommend centralizing this at a government level.
Mm-hmm. So having a central data governance maybe also influences the way we communicate, as you said, to the public, and even might confuse citizens. So, Paul, maybe can you comment on how to communicate with different bodies publishing their data, interpreting their data, having even different dashboards around?
Yeah, let me come to it from a slightly different angle. I think it's, I fully agree with Lucia that sort of having that data available in a central way helps, right? Because the quality of the data and the consistency of the data improves. But what we're seeing is that that's one part of it. And I think over time, where sort of the data that we needed in the beginning was very much the health-related data, right? The cases, the hospital beds, the ICUs, etc. From an open government perspective, now roughly and over time, I mean, we're still in the middle of the pandemic and who knows how many waves we still have, but there is a second very big element coming in. So in the beginning, it was health and procurement in a way. There was a lot of cases of corruption, obviously, that we've seen across the world. We've seen Brazil, Kenya, the US. For us, what is now very important in sort of the next phase, in a way, is the economic side of it, right? There's the economic crisis and the recession we're seeing is the biggest since the Second World War, right? And if you add up the amount of money different governments and supranational bodies have pledged to pour into our economy, it dwarfs what we did in 2008 with the financial crisis. And that brings an enormous risk with it for corruption. And there, I think open data becomes incredibly important again in sort of opening up data sets around beneficial information. Who are the actual owners of companies that get those health contracts, that get those billions coming out of Brussels for recovery? Transparency around sort of do these trillions actually reach the pockets and the plates of those that need it, right? Or does it sort of get lost somewhere in the system? And, which is very important as well, I mean, Anja was talking about the intermediaries. I think sort of where in that first phase of the pandemic, almost the transparency was the key thing that we needed. We needed to know how many tests, how many deaths, how many beds. Going forward, and also specifically for that economic side, I think what will be more important is also the monitoring of and the oversight, not just of Parliament and official watchdogs, but also of civil society and citizens. So how can you make sure that by having the transparency around that data, that we give much more eyes and ears to sort of make sure that what came with it, what comes and pours into societies and economies is spent well. Quick second point I want to make is the importance of the communicator, if you want, and to put two parallels next to each other. And I mean, I watch Germany from where I sit in Brussels, so perhaps I'm seeing it too romantic. But the fact that one of the world's best COVID experts is Berlin-based and is a very good communicator, and the fact that the chancellor is a scientist who's also a very good communicator, brings a very calm and trustworthy message. If I compare that to Belgium, where the experts and politicians are daily on TV disagreeing with each other about what needs to be done to fight this pandemic, and the Prime Minister's first press conference with a PowerPoint that was so complex and confusing, that she created a lot of buzz on social media, but probably not the type of buzz she was hoping for. So that having communication skills and being a trustworthy communicator, I think, is almost as important as the information. You can have the right information, but if you can't bring it across, you will not get very far.
Yeah, that's interesting that you talk about the communicator, because I'm very passionate about open data and on a federal level here in Germany, and the Ministry of Health does not have published any open data yet. So I see like a dichotomy kind of, we have a good communication system maybe from the outside for you guys, but from the inside I say, where is the open data? Why don't you publish any? So yeah, that's interesting to see from a different perspective, I guess. Does any one of you want to add something to Paul?
Yeah,
I have maybe a question for Renate. Since you mentioned that you work on many cases in the previous months of in opening up data sets or maybe helping helping other stakeholders to open up data sets in order to have a better or clearer picture when it comes to the pandemic. Could you make some examples in this regard?
Sure. So one great example, and it ties in a little bit with what's just been said, is definitely about clarity of communication is absolutely critical. And we all, our heads all basically were on fire at the start of the pandemic. We were all running around going, data will give us all the answers and it will help us determine risk and what we can do and what we can't do and when a shop's open and if a library's open. And there's still a lot of things that aren't answered. And now we don't know, because of poor communication and lack of clarity, we now don't know which data sets we can trust, which data sets are providing the data to the recommendations or the behaviors that we've now got to adhere to. And I completely agree that this makes everybody then feel even more insecure and mistrusting of data, whether it's open or otherwise, which is hugely problematic and is something we're going to have to address as we go forward. But so here's a great example. So the government in the UK said that businesses needed to publish, businesses over a certain number of employees needed to publish their go back to work risk assessments. So what were they doing to make sure the workplace was COVID safe and safe for employees to return to? The TUC, which is a trade union organisation in the UK, heard this and decided that they were going to prod every business that they either had a representative working with or go through every business's webpage to make sure that they were actually publishing these risk assessments. And what they did was they built they built a website, they built a dashboard where they publish when the risk assessment was published, and they use some of the tools that we've established and we've created at the ODI to do that, which is great. What they've found is that I think they've got roughly 250, which is a real start, but it's a tiny drop in the ocean. So there was by taking a message the government put out, by then using their power and their network to then prod and not embarrass or shame any company, but saying, look, this is now a requirement for you to do it. By publishing your risk assessments, other companies can learn from you. We'll all have a much better idea as to what's safe, what's not, how this is being gone about, what data is needed, what data other organizations are finding helpful. Might it apply to my organization? This, to me, is a beautiful example of good open data, of everybody learning, of everybody having an opportunity to test and check and to be reassured or to question and challenge and to stand up for individual and workers' rights. So I think that that's a beautiful example. But the bigger point is yeah, you know, we're now in a world where for a long time we haven't understood that our lives are data-driven. And lots of businesses haven't understood that irrespective of what they do, they are a data business. So there's still an element of catching up with that. But at the same time, what this pandemic has done amongst the horrors of it is also alert us and level up a lot of our knowledge to understand that data is critical. What we've now got to do is not undermine that argument by them being, forgive my language, crappy with data, so that we then go, well, is that data set legitimate? Can I trust this data set? And that does come down from communication by all of us, but also, unfortunately, from our politicians.
Yeah, you talked about success stories, organization, public sector bodies, maybe even approaching you and saying, we want to publish the data. When I speak to public sector bodies and civil servants, they always ask, what data? Nobody is using my data. What can it be used for? I just use it in my daily work. And yeah, what do you say to those people? I mean, it's the perfect example when organizations offer to publish the data, but how do we get those that don't want to or don't see the value yet to publish their data?
Was that a question back to me? I'm sorry, I can't see you all either. I'm just staring at myself.
Please, the others can also join as well.
I think we've already mentioned trust. I was running a workshop this morning about how do we identify what data that we need, and the centralized point that was made earlier is really interesting, because certainly in the UK, people are saying actually regional data, regional data, local data is potentially more helpful because it's more nuanced and can help us see that in one part of the country the problems are X, in another part of the country the problems are Y. So there's that. The issue with trust isn't just about individuals, but it is also about companies. As I was saying, we've been trying to convene private and public sector organizations to come together, and I know others on this panel have been working with governments. How do you trust that the data that is about me as an individual, or the data that's about my organization, or the data that's about my country is data that I'm prepared to publish and be open and transparent about, if I don't know that you're going to do the same thing or what you're going to do with this data? And this is an ongoing problem. But at the same time, it is also just about us starting, again, as I say, to understand that data is an integral part of everything. It is infrastructure, but it's still, I personally don't think that we have all fully comprehended that yet. So there's still learning. The more trustworthy, the more transparent, but ultimately the more honest we are about these things, I think that the quicker we might get there. I made a joke in the workshop I was leading at the start of today, that if only we had 5 more years to plan for this pandemic, we might have done it differently. But in truth, if it was 5 years from now or 10 years from now, we might still be experiencing the same dilemmas.
Yeah, thanks. We touched upon intermediaries already. I think some governments rely on those heavily, more than others, in having civil society organizations creating services and showing governments what can be used or what can be done with the data, instead of using it themselves and figuring out how to use the data. As you said, data-driven. Governments can also be data-driven. Maybe, Anja, can you talk about more intermediaries and how important they are?
Yeah, and I perhaps also linking back to the previous discussion. I mean, there's different roles and types of intermediaries. I see, for example, in the the focus that Paul has rightly mentioned on, trustworthy communications. That's a role, like a data intermediary role, that is helping make sense of information that we at the Open Data Charter like to push for open data to be not just machine readable, but also human readable and understandable. And sometimes that's going to require, we don't think that everyone has to acquire, expert data science or data literacy skills, and certainly not something that doesn't happen overnight. But there are skills sets that can be, or roles of intermediaries in terms of this communication that can help establish some sense of trust. And also, I think importantly, honesty, sort of honest communication about what it is that we don't know, what types of limitations are within those data that we know. It's an inherently political process that in the backside, there's decisions, someone's making decisions about what to collect, how to structure it, who to share it with, and why. So that is going to require sort of being honest about what sorts of biases or inequities it carries with it. And on the other hand, in terms of these different roles for other players to come in to the process of informing how decisions are made about data, I think it's also about this role of monitoring and oversight that has been mentioned. But it's important that how we're releasing information, at what point in time that data is being made available, is done so in a way that is still allowing for meaningful engagement and citizens, civil society organizations, independent bodies to be able to test assumptions. For example, these risks assessments to be put out in a way that are timely, not after the fact, having, when decisions are already made. But I think it's crucial. There's a crucial role there for open data to play in supporting greater participation from the public in giving feedback in terms of how decisions are made and the ultimate outcomes that shape the way data is governed and used.
Yeah, thank you so much. I mean, we started the panel later than planned, but time is already closing. I would like to invite the few participants here in the room to, if there's a question, yeah, please.
Yes. Oliver speaking from Own Government Network Germany. So as we are luckily approaching more and more backing from the legislation in open data, for example, the the Foundation for Evidence-Based Policymaking Act in the US, in Europe now the regulation for high-value data. So the topic of overseeing of the oversight activities gets, in my opinion, more and more now in focus of work to be done. And the question is if there could be more tools to automate this oversight, especially when it comes on municipal level. It's really getting hard and much of work, and I was really happy to see that HIVOS East Africa was having a call 2 weeks ago for building a technology for overseeing releasing of information, public information, just to get this more central in mind. And as the ODI is in the study team of the high-value data regulation, so what's important then is when the high-value data have to be described very well, so that the oversight can really be automized then. As sharp as possible, this is described, the better is overseen.
I don't know if you're looking to me to respond to that.
If you like to.
I can't see anyone other than myself, and all I can see is me pulling funny faces. So I'm sorry. I don't actually have any response. I mean, I'm not across that work, but I will certainly pass that back to the team. I'm sorry. Maybe somebody else has something clever to say.
Maybe the others have an insight on monitoring.
I think it's a very interesting question, and you mentioned in terms of automation, where we are seeing some rapid algorithms and uses of data already having an impact are in the procurement sector, and developing red flags of irregularities for how procurement plays out, to know, ahead of the fact, or to signal out where there might be contracts that are prone to corruption. So that, it can be both at the municipal and national levels, but I think one that is very promising.
Thank you. Other remarks from there's one question.
Yes, hi. Hello, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Well, Martin from the Austrian Ministry for Digital Affairs, PSI, and Open Data Task Force. Actually, it's a very important debate. I also kind of remember those days in the beginning of the pandemics when we saw politicians showing nice charts and graphics to the audience and showing, yeah, this is the data actually, and this is so we fulfilled our obligation. Here you can see it, but people started to be discontent with this way of publishing data, and I think it was not really touched upon that much. But science is also very much reliant on these data sets, and it is up to scientists and to citizens themselves to judge what they can do with this data. But my question actually here would be, and I think it's very important what you pointed out in this debate, these public procurement data actually. As I know, the question is actually, what do you say about personal data being published among these data sets? Of course, it's about transparency, and transparency sometimes is not so much. Transparency is something different than open data. But even with the high-value data sets at European level, I see that there are great problems actually with personal data that is contained in these elements for being published. Maybe you can respond on that.
Are you referring to personal data within public procurement data?
Yes.
So, I mean, I would argue there that personal data is, and it's already treated differently in legislation, regarding, information about public officials or the use of public funds. So where there is, people in positions of power, the idea of opening information about them, about their expenses, what they're contracting, and how all these are informing their decisions. The idea is to, redress that power and ensuring there's an ability to scrutinize decisions so that they're made in the good of the public. So I would treat very differently the notion of privacy around that type of information, which is why it's important, to push for beneficial ownership data being made available in cases of public contracts being handed out. There's always, tools that could be helpful in assessing the risks in terms of privacy assessment impacts. But I think there's a separate, focus in terms of procurement data and how we treat that, which is why we always like to focus in this issue in particular, context really matters. So it's not the same how we treat personal information in that regard, in difference, of how we treat personal information around health and sort of more broadly the public personal information. I don't know if that captures your question.
Thank you so much. I think that are all the answers. Maybe we can finish the panel with a few last statements. I was thinking about how open government data might change after the pandemic. Maybe if there is an end, what mechanisms change, what standards changed. Maybe you can comment 1 or 2 sentences on that, and then we finish. Lucia.
It's true that the COVID-19 pandemic has further exposed the need for a better data governance. And so the need to have advanced mechanism and standards that can facilitate the outreach to relevant stakeholders in times of crisis has become more and more important. And so I would say that international collaborations, for example, to identify the types of data that can be categorized as high value in a crisis, and also to support reform of policies has become a priority. A second point would be that standardized data management would also help increase cross-government and multi-level government and cross-border interoperability of public sector data sharing as a key instrument for leveraging data to respond to the global crisis.
Yeah, thank you. Renato, do you want to add on that?
Well, the UK has just published its national data strategy, which is now open for consultation, which probably gives some sort of a steer as to what's next. I mean, obviously, we also do have Brexit, so that's going to be an interesting process that we're going through. But I mean, ultimately, a lot of this is to do with communication, a lot of it's to do with legacy systems, a lot of it's to do with trust. I think this is exposed where things have been working kind of well. It's exposed where we need to have much better conversations and we need to now learn much better how to have them, like identify the problem. Don't just talk about all the data, be specific. But also it's identified that there's opportunity for real change. So let's hope we can get there to not just address the pandemic and health issues, but as has been raised, to address the long-term financial situation, the economic situation we now find ourselves in, along with every other country in the world.
Yeah, thank you. Paul, final remarks on that?
Yeah, thanks. Two, I think one is, I think Anja said it in the beginning, I mean, the pandemic showed the fault lines in our information ecosystem and structures. At the same time, in other places, you've seen that the crisis has accelerated some things that were not possible before. So never waste a good crisis, right, is one of those things. I think what we can learn from it, two things. One is to prepare in advance. So learn from what now worked and didn't work, and make sure when the next pandemic hits that in terms of open data, at least, and communication, we know much better what to do. And the second one is, which also for me comes out of this one, and I think also Renato, Anja mentioned it, is this now has shown that tension that we were aware of, but never was as sharp as before between opening up data and information and balancing it with fundamental rights, including privacy, but also freedom of expression, etc. This now shows there is a real tension there that we can't keep pushing forward, but that we really have to fix. And in my view, more for the personal data and the privacy than for the example Martin from Austria just raised for, procurement and beneficial ownership. I think when it comes to corruption and procurement and beneficial ownership, I think you can of course you have to be careful, but I have less. My bar for privacy is less high than when it comes to personal health data.
Yeah, thank you so much. I personally would like to see more open data on a federal level in Germany and see some of the ministries that haven't published data at all, maybe to start this year or next year. That would be a big step for me personally. And I'm surprised that we didn't have any technical issues. As you said, some things wouldn't have been possible without the pandemic. So having this panel solely digital, I think, is a first as well. So thank you so much also for the questions from the room, and hope to see and hear you soon.